The blockade. The blockade is the blunt force instrument of energy warfare. It relies on simple geography. You take a maritime choke point, like the Strait of Hormuz or the Bab al-Mandeb in the Red Sea, and you park heavily armed warships, sea mines, or missile batteries right in the middle of it. The mechanic is absolute physical denial. You don't ask the enemy to stop trading. You physically prevent the ship from moving forward. At its peak, a blockade induces instant, terrifying panic. If the Strait of Hormuz is clamped shut, 20% of the entire globe's seaborne oil simply ceases to exist on the open market. The onset is immediate. Ships drop anchor. Global crude prices skyrocket overnight. Supply chains freeze. The attacking nation holds the world hostage. But the blockade has a fatal flaw. It is a glass cannon. You cannot blockade an international waterway without committing an act of war. As soon as you lock down a choke point, you invite the immediate, overwhelming firepower of global navies. It is the loudest, most dangerous weapon on the board, which is why it is almost never used, only threatened. The bypass. The bypass is the geopolitical cheat code. When the ocean becomes too dangerous, you leave the ocean. The bypass is a massive, multi-billion-dollar steel straw built directly across land. Think of the Saudi East-West pipeline, or the UAE's pipeline to Fujairah. The mechanic is beautifully simple. Instead of loading a tanker in a vulnerable gulf and sailing it through a heavily mined choke point, you pump the crude overland to a completely different, safer ocean. At its peak, the bypass is a miracle of logistics. Millions of barrels teleport past the danger zone without a single ship ever entering the crosshairs. It neutralizes the enemy's blockade entirely. But the bypass has a glaring limitation. A ship can change its destination mid-voyage. A pipeline cannot. It is permanently bolted to the earth. It is extraordinarily expensive to build, costs millions to maintain, and its fixed coordinates make it a sitting duck for our next weapon. Sabotage. Sabotage is the ghost weapon. It is the act of inflicting maximum physical destruction with zero official fingerprints. Instead of sending an army to stop oil production, you send an anonymous drone swarm to a refinery in the middle of the night. Or you send deep-sea divers to pack explosives onto the Nord Stream pipeline at the bottom of the Baltic Sea. The mechanic is plausible deniability. At its peak, sabotage paralyzes your enemy's economy without triggering a formal war. The damage is instant, catastrophic, and completely scrambles global energy markets. The target country loses billions of dollars in infrastructure and revenue in a single fiery flash. The calm-down, however, is messy. Sabotage permanently destroys the very infrastructure you might one day need. It poisons the diplomatic well forever. And if the attacker's identity is actually proven, the plausible deniability evaporates, leaving them exposed to total economic or military retaliation. The squeeze and the flood. The squeeze and the flood are the ultimate market levers. This weapon doesn't destroy ships or pipelines. It weaponizes the actual flow of oil from the earth. It is wielded almost exclusively by OPEC+ and the world's mega producers. It works in two opposite directions. First, the squeeze. The producing nations agree to cut millions of barrels of oil from their daily output. The world starves for energy, supply shrinks, and the price of a barrel shoots into the stratosphere. The producing nations do less work and make billions more in profit. Second, the flood. The producing nations open the taps to maximum capacity. They drown the market in cheap oil. Why do this? To bankrupt rivals. When the price of oil crashes to $30 a barrel, nations with expensive drilling costs, like US shale producers, bleed cash and go out of business. But manipulating the Earth's oil valve has a brutal calm-down. If you squeeze the market too hard and prices stay too high, you trigger global inflation, and buyers abandon you for alternative energy. If you flood the market for too long, you bankrupt your enemies, but you also bleed your own national treasury dry. It is a dangerous game of economic chicken. The sanction. The sanction is the invisible blockade. Instead of using warships to stop a tanker, you use paperwork. You weaponize the global banking and insurance systems. When Western powers place sanctions on nations like Russia or Iran, they don't sink the ships. They make it mathematically toxic to do business with them. The mechanic works by threatening any bank that processes the payment, and any company that insures the cargo. Without a letter of credit and a multi-million-dollar insurance policy, a tanker legally cannot enter a major port. At its peak, the sanction works like an economic heart attack. The target nation's revenue evaporates. Their tankers sit idle in the ocean, loaded with crude that no one is legally allowed to buy. But the fatal flaw of the sanction is that it is a decaying asset. The more you use it, the less it works. When you lock a desperate, oil-rich nation out of the global banking system, they don't just give up, they adapt. They build alternative payment networks, they trade in different currencies, and most importantly, they build the underworld's most powerful weapon, the shadow fleet. The shadow fleet is the smuggler's counterattack. When sanctions lock a country out of the legal market, they go dark. The shadow fleet is a massive, unregulated armada of aging, rusting oil tankers. As of early 2026, this ghost fleet has swollen to over 20,700 vessels, moving tens of millions of barrels of Russian and Iranian crude completely off the books. The mechanic is pure deception. These ships use flags of convenience from countries with zero oversight. They turn off their automatic tracking transponders. They spoof their GPS signals to make it look like they are in one ocean, while they are actually loading illegal oil in another. They meet in the dead of night in international waters to do ship-to-ship transfers, mixing illegal oil with legal oil to wash its origins. At its peak, the shadow fleet makes sanctions look like a joke. It allows heavily embargoed nations to fund their governments and militaries as if nothing happened. The trap is the catastrophic risk. These ships are 20 years old. They lack proper maintenance. They lack legitimate insurance. They are ticking environmental time bombs. If a shadow tanker breaks down and spills 1,000,000 barrels of crude onto a coastline, the owners vanish like ghosts, leaving the world to pay the ultimate price. The currency weapon. The currency weapon is the master key to global dominance. For over 50 years, global oil has been overwhelmingly priced and traded in a single currency, the United States dollar. This is the petrodollar. The mechanic is absolute financial gravity. Because every nation on Earth needs oil to survive, every nation on Earth must hold reserves of US dollars to buy it. This creates a perpetual, infinite demand for American currency, allowing the US to print money, control global debt, and wield total financial hegemony. At its peak, the petrodollar means the US can bankrupt a rival nation, freezing their dollar reserves in international banks. But the calm down is a geopolitical earthquake. By over-weaponizing the dollar, the US has triggered a massive counter-movement. Nations in the BRICS alliance are actively pushing de-dollarization. They are cutting side deals to buy oil in Chinese yuan, Indian rupees, or gold. It is a slow, grinding transition. But if the world stops needing dollars to buy oil, the ultimate financial weapon loses its ammo, and the global economic order resets it entirely. The vault. When offensive weapons fail, a nation relies on the vault. This is the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or SPR. It is the ultimate defensive weapon. The panic button, every major superpower has one. The United States stores hundreds of millions of barrels in artificially hollowed-out salt caverns deep underground. China has spent the last decade aggressively filling massive coastal tank farms to bulletproof its economy. And across Europe, nations are legally bound by international agreements to hoard a minimum of 90 days' worth of emergency oil at all times. The mechanic is simple. Hoard it for doomsday. When an attacker uses a blockade, sabotage, or a production squeeze to paralyze a target country, the defending nation's leaders crack open the vault. At its peak, the SPR acts as an economic shock absorber. By flooding their own domestic market with millions of barrels of emergency crude, the defending nation instantly neutralizes the attacker's leverage. The price shock is canceled out, and the economy breathes a sigh of relief. But the fatal flaw of the vault is that it is entirely finite. It is a band-aid, not a cure. Once a country drains its reserves, the safety net is gone, leaving them completely exposed to the whims of the market. And refilling it takes years, often forcing the government to buy back millions of barrels at much higher prices. It buys a nation time, but if the crisis outlasts the reserve, the vault becomes an empty tomb.